Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. No one knew where the dog had come from, nor when the first stories about it began. For as long as anyone could remember, travelers passing through the deep forests, winding mountain roads, and endless stretches of forgotten countryside spoke of a spectral dog, a silent, shadowy creature with glowing eyes that appeared when they were most lost. It never barked. It never strayed from its path. It simply walked ahead, leading the way until somehow the lost found their way home. Some called it a ghost, others a guardian spirit. A few believed it was the soul of a loyal pet that could not leave this world until every lost traveler was safely returned. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. Those who followed the phantom dog always found their way back. But where did it come from? And who, if anyone, had ever seen it more than once? Elias had never been afraid of the woods. He had grown up with the trees, the rivers, the whispering winds that swept through the valley. Even in the dead of winter, when the snow piled high and the nights stretched long, he felt safe among the towering pines. But that night, the storm was worse than anything he had known. He had left his grandfather's cabin just before dusk, planning to return to town before dark. But the snow had come faster than expected, and within an hour the trail had vanished. The familiar landmarks, gnarled trees, jagged rock formations, were buried beneath an endless expanse of white. Elias walked for what felt like hours, his breath thick in the freezing air, his limbs growing heavy. Fear crept in. He knew these woods, but the storm had changed them. Everything looked the same. Everything looked wrong. Then he saw it. A large dog, barely visible against the snow. Its coat was thick and dark, its eyes golden and piercing. It stood ahead of him on the trail, if there even was a trail anymore, watching. Elias called out, but the dog did not move. He took a step forward. The dog turned and began walking. There was something strange about the way it moved, smooth and silent, as if its paws never truly touched the ground. Elias hesitated, then followed. The dog never looked back, never strayed from its path. And after what felt like an eternity, Elias saw the lights of his grandfather's cabin through the trees. When he turned to thank the dog, it was gone. The next morning, when Elias told his grandfather about the strange animal, the old man nodded solemnly. "You saw the ghost dog," he said. "It comes to those who are lost." Sarah had been driving for hours, trying to find her way back to the highway after taking a wrong turn on an old back road. Her phone had no signal, and the gas gauge was creeping toward empty. The road narrowed, then turned to gravel, then to dirt. The trees pressed in close. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour. Panic settled in. She had been sure she was heading in the right direction, but now everything looked the same. Had she passed that crooked oak before? Had she already driven by that rusted road sign? Then up ahead, standing in the middle of the road, was a dog. It was large, with thick black fur and glowing eyes that reflected her headlights. Sarah slowed the car. The dog turned and walked into the trees. Something about the way it moved made her pulse quicken. It wasn't a normal dog. There was no hesitation, no sniffing, no sound of paws against the frozen ground. It moved like a shadow gliding between the trees. Sarah hesitated, but then, was there really any other choice? She turned off the engine and stepped out. The dog waited. She followed. For nearly 20 minutes, she stumbled through the trees, following the dark shape as it wove through the woods. Then suddenly, she was standing on the edge of a paved road, a road she recognized. The dog was gone. Sarah never told anyone what she had seen, There were stories, of course, whispers in small towns, legends passed down by the elders. Some said the dog was the spirit of a pet that had once saved its owner from being lost, and now it spent eternity helping others. Others believed it was something older, something that had always existed, a guide between the living and the dead. There were even those who claimed it appeared not only to the lost, but to those who were truly lost, those who had wandered too far from themselves, from their lives, from their purpose. And if you followed it, you might not only find your way home, you might find something you didn't even know you were looking for. No one knows how many people the phantom dog has guided over the years. No one knows if it will ever stop. But even now, when the night is dark and the road stretches long, when the woods whisper and the wind howls, some still claim to see it, waiting at the edge of the unknown, golden eyes glowing softly in the dark. And if you ever find yourself lost, truly lost, perhaps you will see it too. And if you do follow, it will lead you home. The key had no name, no history, and no rightful owner. It had existed for centuries, passed from hand to hand, lost and found, forgotten and remembered. It was small, no larger than the length of a finger, made of an old tarnished metal that never rusted. Its bow was circular, engraved with symbols no one could read, and its teeth were jagged in a pattern that seemed too intricate for any ordinary lock. But the key did not open ordinary doors. It opened doors to forgotten places, places lost to time, hidden between reality and memory. Abandoned rooms that no longer existed, buried cities, locked passages that had long since been sealed away. And once a door was opened, it could never be locked again. Elena found the key in the least likely of places, an antique shop at the edge of town, tucked between a dusty bookshelf and a broken clock. She hadn't meant to go inside. The shop was the kind of place most people walk past without a second glance. Its windows were clouded with dust, its sign hung crookedly above the door, and the bell that jingled when she entered sounded rusted and sad. The shopkeeper was an old man with sharp eyes and hands covered in ink stains. He barely looked at her as she wandered the aisles, running her fingers over relics of the past. Weathered books, tarnished silverware, paintings with eyes that seemed to follow her, and then she saw it, a key resting inside a glass case, lit by a single flickering bulb. She couldn't explain why she felt drawn to it, but the moment she saw it, she knew she had to have it. "How much?" she asked. The old man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "That key doesn't belong to anyone," he said. "It finds its own owner." Elena hesitated. "Then why is it here?" The man shrugged. "Perhaps it was waiting for you." He named a price so low it felt like a mistake. But when she handed him the money, he made no move to take it, only pushed the key toward her with a knowing look. "Be careful where you use it," he said. "Some doors were forgotten for a reason." That night, Elena sat on her bed, turning the key over in her hands. It felt heavier than it should have, the metal cool against her skin. She didn't know why, but something told her to try it. She stood up, walked to her closet, and pressed the key against the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a soft click, the lock turned. Though her closet had never had a lock before. Heart pounding, she opened the door. It did not lead to her closet. Instead, she saw a grand, abandoned ballroom. Dust covered the marble floors, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen ghosts. Moonlight filtered through broken stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the empty room. She stepped forward. The air was thick with the scent of age, of forgotten laughter, lost music, memories that no longer had a home. And then, in the silence, she heard it, soft footsteps echoing in the distance. She wasn't alone. Elena spent weeks testing the key, finding doors where none should exist. It opened a hidden chamber beneath an old church, where candlelight flickered against stone walls covered in ancient writing. It led her to a lost garden buried beneath a ruined castle, where flowers grew in defiance of time. It revealed a staircase inside her bedroom wall, spiraling downward into a place where the air smelled of old books and ink. She followed the staircase into a vast library, where shelves stretched endlessly into the dark, filled with books that no one had read in centuries. Some had titles in languages she didn't recognize. Others had no titles at all. A single candle flickered on a wooden table in the center of the room, and beside it sat a man. He was old, older than the antique shopkeeper, older than anyone she had ever seen. His skin was lined with age, his hair silver, his hands resting on the cover of an open book. He looked up as she entered, as if he had been expecting her. "You found the key," he said. Elena hesitated. "Who are you?" "The keeper of forgotten things," he said, "and you have unlocked a door that should have remained closed." Elena didn't understand until the nightmares began. She woke in the middle of the night to whispers coming from behind her closet door. She found doors in places where there shouldn't be doors, inside her own home, in her school, in the middle of the sidewalk. Some doors led to wonders, others led to darkness. One night she tried to lock a door behind her, to close the path to a place that filled her with unease, but the key would not turn backward. Once a door was opened, it could never be locked again. She had let something out, and now it was looking for her. She started seeing them in the corners of her vision, figures that didn't belong in the world she knew. They were the forgotten ones, beings trapped behind the doors, waiting for someone to set them free. Some whispered her name, some followed her home, some stood in the shadows watching. The man in the library had warned her. Some doors were forgotten for a reason, and now the only way to stop them was to find the original lock, the one door that could seal them away. Elena searched every forgotten place the key had taken her, through ruined palaces and endless corridors, through sunken cities and empty temples, and finally she found it, a towering door at the edge of a place that should not exist. It was covered in carvings, in words too ancient to read. The figures gathered behind her, whispering, waiting. She raised the key, and for the first time, it resisted. The key did not want to turn. She pressed harder, heart pounding. The figures screamed. With a final twist, the lock clicked, and the door sealed shut. The whispers stopped. The figures were gone. The key, once heavy, was now nothing more than an old piece of metal in her palm. Elena never used the key again. She locked it away in a place no one would find. Years passed. The world moved on. And then one day in an antique shop at the edge of town, a small tarnished key appeared inside a glass case, waiting for someone new to find it. For as long as anyone could remember, fire had been something both feared and worshipped. It brought warmth, light, and protection, yet it could also destroy, consume, and leave nothing but ash in its wake. But there was one flame that did not obey the laws of nature, a candle whose fire never wavered, never dimmed, never went out. No wind could snuff it, no water could drown it, no hand could pinch it into darkness. Legends whispered of its origins. Some claimed it was the work of a long-forgotten alchemist, seeking a fire that would outlast time itself. Others believed it was a gift or a curse from a god of flame, given to humanity for reasons unknown. But the truth, as always, was far stranger. And one day the candle was found again. Jonas had always been drawn to the strange and the forgotten. His small shop, curiosities and relics, was filled with oddities from every corner of the world. Antique clocks that ticked backward, keys to doors that no longer existed, mirrors that showed glimpses of the past. But nothing in his collection was quite like the candle. He found it at a traveling market, hidden among trinkets and rusted artifacts. The vendor, An old woman with sharp eyes and fingers covered in silver rings held it up as he passed. "You have an eye for things with stories," she said. "Perhaps you'll appreciate this one." The candle was small, made of black wax that seemed almost too smooth, too perfect. The wick glowed with a steady, golden flame, though there was no sign of melting wax or heat. Jonas reached out cautiously. The flame did not flicker. "How much?" he asked. The old woman smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "It's not a matter of price," she said. "It's a matter of responsibility." Jonas frowned. "What do you mean?" She placed the candle in his hands. "You'll see." And with that, she turned and vanished into the crowd. Jonas stood there for a long moment, staring at the flickering flame. Then carefully he blew on it. It did not go out. Back in his shop, Jonas tried everything. He waved his hand over the flame. Nothing. He cupped his hands and blew. Nothing. He poured water over it. Nothing. He even placed a glass jar over the candle, sealing it completely. No oxygen, no air. Yet the flame burned on, undisturbed. It should have been impossible. His mind raced. Was it a trick? A chemical reaction? Some hidden mechanism within the wax? But the candle left no wax drippings, no smoke. It did not even feel warm. It simply existed. And that, he realized, was when the strange things began. The first sign that the candle was more than just an anomaly came late at night. Jonas had fallen asleep at his desk, books open around him, notes scrawled in the margins. The shop was dark, save for the candle's steady glow. And then he heard it, a whisper, soft, distant, like wind moving through old halls. Jonas jolted awake. The shop was silent. The candle flickered, though there was no breeze. He rubbed his eyes. Had he imagined it? Then the whisper came again. Not words, not exactly. More like the echo of something forgotten, something ancient. It was like standing at the entrance of a place where no living thing had stepped for centuries. Jonas shivered. The candle was not just fire, it was something else. Jonas became obsessed. He scoured his books, searching for anything, any mention of a flame that could not be extinguished. He found hints in old alchemical texts, stories of eternal flames that burned in temples long abandoned. There were whispers of lost civilizations that had wielded fire beyond mortal understanding, of flames that guarded tombs, sealed secrets, and lit the path for wandering souls. And then he found something that made his breath catch. An old manuscript spoke of a candle of the unseen door, a flame that did not burn for light, but for revelation. The text was faded, the words cryptic, but the meaning was clear. The candle does not burn to warm the living. It is a key, and once the door is opened, it cannot be closed. Jonas stared at the flame. A key? A key to what? He had to find out. That night, Jonas took the candle into the basement of his shop, a place filled with forgotten things, relics of lost histories. He set the candle down and watched. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the flame flickered, just once, sharply like a pulse, and the wall before him changed. The bricks wavered, blurred, like a reflection in rippling water. Then, as if they had never been there at all, they faded away, revealing a doorway. Beyond it, darkness. Jonas swallowed hard. The candle's light did not reach past the threshold, but he knew deep in his bones that whatever lay beyond was not meant to be seen. And yet, he stepped forward. The air beyond the doorway was thick with dust, with the scent of something ancient. Jonas stepped cautiously, the candle in his hand, its flame steady despite the unnatural stillness. He saw them then, figures in the dark, frozen in time. Statues? Number not statues. People, or what had once been people. They stood in silence, their faces lost to shadow, their forms half faded. as if the candle's light could not fully reveal them. Jonas took another step. A whisper echoed through the void. "You have come too far." His breath caught. The figures moved ever so slightly. Not a step, not a shift. Just the faintest tilt of their heads as if they had noticed him. And in that moment, Jonas understood. The candle did not simply reveal forgotten places. It revealed those who had been forgotten too. And they were waiting for the one who carried the flame, waiting for him. No one knows what happened to Jonas after that night. The shop was found abandoned, his notes scattered, his books left open, but there was no sign of him, no sign of struggle. Only the candle remained, its flame still burning, its glow untouched by time. And now it waits, for the next to find it, for the next to listen to the whispers, for the next to open the door. And when they do, when you do, remember this. Some flames are not meant to light the way. Some flames are meant to call something back. The candle was not supposed to exist. Fire by its nature is temporary, born from fuel, consuming, burning, and then dying. But this flame defied nature. It did not flicker in the wind. It did not wane in the rain. It did not smolder into darkness, no matter how hard one tried to snuff it out. And yet, despite its unnatural persistence, the flame was not hot. It did not burn wax, nor did it scorch the air around it. It simply was, an eternal ember in a world where everything was meant to fade. Some believed it was a gift, others a curse. But one thing was certain. Those who possessed the candle never remained the same. Alec had never been the type to believe in superstition. He ran a small antique shop dealing in forgotten relics, half-truths, and objects that came with stories too wild to be real. He had seen it all. Mirrors rumored to show glimpses of the future, keys said to unlock doors that no longer existed, coins cursed to bring misfortune. To him, these were just stories, good for business, but nothing more. That was before the candle arrived. It came with an old merchant, a man wrapped in layers of tattered cloth, his face hidden beneath the hood of a heavy cloak. He walked into Alec's shop one evening, just before closing, and set a small wooden box on the counter. "For you," the merchant said in a voice that rasped like dry leaves. Alec frowned. "I didn't order anything." The merchant smiled. "An unsettling thing. Number but, it belongs to you now." He turned and left before Alec could ask another question. Inside the box, nestled in black velvet, was the candle. Its wax was deep red, almost the color of dried blood. Its wick was already burning, a steady golden flame that cast no heat, no shadow. Alec reached out, hesitated, then waved a hand over it. Nothing. Frowning, he tried to pinch the wick between his fingers. The flame did not flicker. He blew on it. Nothing. Curious now, he grabbed a glass and turned it over, trapping the candle inside. No air, no oxygen, and yet the flame continued to burn. Alec spent the next few days trying everything he could think of to extinguish the flame. He doused it with water. Nothing. He buried it in sand. Nothing. He locked it in his freezer overnight, but when he pulled it out, the flame still flickered, unaffected by the ice. He even tried to smother it in a vacuum-sealed container, but the fire burned on as if it existed in a world of its own. More unsettling was the fact that, despite the wick burning, the candle itself never melted. It was unnatural, impossible, and yet it was. As the days passed, strange things started happening. Customers who came into Alec's shop paused when they saw the candle, their gazes lingering on the flame as if drawn to it. Some muttered that it felt familiar, though none could say why. One old woman gasped when she saw it. "That candle," she whispered. "It was in my grandmother's house when I was a child." Another man swore he had seen it decades ago, locked inside a glass case in a museum that no longer existed. And then there were the dreams. Alex started waking in the middle of the night, the scent of smoke clinging to his skin, though there was no sign of fire. He dreamed of places he had never been, endless halls of stone, filled with flickering candlelight, a vast underground chamber where thousands of flames burned, each one identical to his own. And in the dreams, he was never alone. Something watched from the darkness, something waiting. One night, as Alec was locking up the shop, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. Turning, he found himself staring at his own reflection in the shop's antique mirror. But something was wrong. The reflection of the candle in the mirror flickered wildly, though the real flame remained steady. And standing behind his reflection, just at the edge of sight, was a figure. Alex spun around. Nothing. But when he looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. A man dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured by shadow. Alex's pulse pounded. He took a slow step forward. The figure did not move. Then in a voice barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "Do not let it go out." Alex stumbled backward. The voice had been inside his head, a whisper pressed against his thoughts like a cold hand. The figure stepped forward in the reflection, though Alec remained frozen in place. The flame is all that remains. The shop door burst open, the wind howling through. The candle flickered, just once, and for the first time since he had received it, Alec felt something cold wrap around his heart. The candle could go out, and if it did, something would come through. Alec didn't sleep that night. He spent hours staring at the flame, the weight of the warning pressing into his thoughts. What did the figure mean? What would happen if the candle went out? He thought back to the merchant, the way he had spoken, the strange certainty in his voice. "It belongs to you now." Had the candle always existed? Had it been passed down through time, always finding someone new? Was it lighting the way for something, or was it keeping something away? The more he thought about it, the more he was certain. This candle was not a gift. It was a lock. And somewhere, hidden beyond the veil of what could be seen, was a door that should never be opened. Alec knew he had a choice. He could keep the candle burning, carry it, protect it, ensure the flame never wavered. Or he could test the warning. He could let it go out and see what happened. He almost convinced himself not to, but curiosity had always been his downfall. So in the deep silence of the night, Alec took a deep breath and blew out the candle. Darkness fell, not the kind of darkness that came with night, but something deeper, a void where no light existed. Alec's breath came sharp and fast. He reached for his phone, but the screen did not turn on. The street lights outside his window had gone out. The world was silent. And then, a single spark. The candle flickered back to life, the flame reigniting on its own. And in its glow, Alex saw them, the shadows that had been waiting, the ones that should never have been seen. And as they stepped forward, the whisper came again. This time not from the mirror, not from his thoughts, but from the darkness itself. "You should not have done that." The candle burns still, but Alec is gone. And now it waits for the next to find it, for the next to test the flame, for the next to open the door. They say memories fade over time, that the sharp edges of pain dull, that grief softens, that wounds heal. But what if they didn't? What if there was a door, hidden in the forgotten places of the world, that could take you back? Not just in thought, but in reality. A door that did not show you a memory, but made you live it. Would you open it? Would you step through knowing that beyond it lay the worst moment of your life? Some doors should never be opened. Some memories should stay buried. But for those who find the doorway, they don't always get a choice. Isaac hadn't planned to stop. The house stood at the edge of town, abandoned for longer than anyone could remember. It was the kind of place people whispered about, the kind that kids dared each other to step inside. No one ever did, but Isaac had never believed in ghost stories. He was just passing through, a traveler with no real destination. When the storm hit, the house was the only shelter for miles. Thunder rumbled overhead as he stepped onto the sagging porch. The front door hung slightly open, an invitation he did not refuse. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of rotting wood and time. The floor creaked under his weight as he moved through the house, scanning for a place to wait out the rain. Then he saw it, a door standing alone at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others. Where the rest of the house was in decay, this door was pristine. Smooth, polished wood, an iron handle that gleamed despite the dust covering everything else. And carved into its surface, in flowing script, were 4 words. Remember what you forgot. A shiver ran down his spine. He should turn back, but something about the door called to him. His hand reached for the handle, hesitated, and then, before he could think better of it, he turned the knob. The door swung open, and the world fell away. There was no room beyond the doorway. No walls, no furniture, no house. Just darkness, stretching endlessly. Isaac stepped forward, and the ground shifted beneath him. No, not the ground. The air. One moment, he was in the abandoned house. The next, he was somewhere else entirely. A cold wind rushed past him. The scent of burning wood filled his nose. The sound of distant voices, shouting, crying. His stomach twisted. He knew this place. A narrow street. Buildings too close together. Their wooden beams aged and cracked. The warm glow of streetlights flickering against the rain-soaked pavement. It was his hometown. Not as it was now, but as it had been. As it had been that night. The worst night of his life. Isaac's breath hitched as he turned the corner. And there they were. His mother. His father. Standing in the dim light of their small shop. Arguing behind the counter. And there, just outside the window, was himself. Not the man he was now, but the boy he had been. 16 years old, rain-soaked and angry, fists clenched at his sides. He remembered this night. Every detail burned into his mind. This was the night he ran away. The night he left home after a fight with his father, swearing he'd never return. The night the fire started. The night his parents died. Isaac's chest tightened. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He turned back, tried to find the doorway, to step back into the house, but it was gone. The street stretched endlessly in both directions. There was no way out. The memory had swallowed him whole, and it was happening again. Isaac ran toward the shop. He burst through the door, heart pounding. His parents didn't react. They didn't see him, didn't hear him. He wasn't really there. He was just a ghost in his own past, trapped in a moment that had already been written. He turned to his younger self, the boy standing in the doorway, rain dripping from his clothes. He watched as the argument played out. You need to take responsibility, Isaac. I never asked for any of this. You can't just walk away from your family. Watch me. Isaac's younger self turned, shoving open the door. And then, the smell of smoke, the first flicker of fire from the back of the shop, the forgotten candle, the one his mother had knocked over in the argument, the one that would soon consume the whole building. Isaac lunged forward, trying to grab the candle, trying to stop it. But his hands passed through the world like mist. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a vision. It was a memory, and memories could not be changed. Isaac screamed. He pounded his fists against the walls as the fire grew, as his mother and father turned in horror, realizing too late what was happening. His younger self was already gone. By the time the fire consumed the shop, he had been blocks away, too angry to hear the screams. He had always imagined what their last moments had been like. Now he knew, and he could do nothing. The flames surged, smoke filled his lungs, and just before the fire swallowed him whole, the door appeared, standing in the center of the burning shop. The words carved into its wood glowed in the firelight. "Remember what you forgot." Isaac stumbled forward, gasping. His hand touched the handle, and the world shattered. Isaac awoke on the floor of the abandoned house. The storm outside had passed. The air was still. The door at the end of the hallway was closed once more, its polished wood untouched, as if it had never been opened. His hands trembled. His heart ached. But something was different. The memory had always haunted him. The guilt, the regret. He had spent years running from it, trying to forget. But the door had taken that choice away. It had made him remember, not just in his mind, but in his soul. And now he could never forget again. The door had shown him the past, had made him relive it. And he knew without a doubt that if he ever opened it again, it would show him something worse. Some doors should never be opened, and some memories should stay buried. They say there's a fountain hidden deep in the woods, where the trees grow too close together, where the ground is always damp, even in the hottest summers. It is old, older than anyone knows, older than the town itself. Some say it was built by ancient hands long before the first settlers arrived. Others whisper that it wasn't built at all, that it simply appeared one day, the water bubbling up from the ground like a secret trying to escape. They say it grants wishes, but every wish comes with a price. And once you drink from its waters, you can never undo what has been done. Ethan Gray was not the kind of man who believed in fairy tales. He was a skeptic, a man of logic and reason. But desperation has a way of making people believe in things they would normally dismiss. His daughter Lily was dying. The doctors had tried everything. The treatments had failed. There was nothing left to do but wait. Then late one night, he heard the story. An old woman at the hospital, a nurse with tired eyes and a voice like cracked leather, had whispered it to him after seeing the grief on his face. "There's a fountain," she had said, "deep in the Blackwood forest. You won't find it on any map, but if you search long enough, it will find you. It grants wishes, but..." She had hesitated then, her gaze shadowed with something close to fear. "The price is never what you expect." Ethan had laughed it off, at first, but as the days passed and as Lily grew weaker, the idea lodged itself in his mind like a thorn. What did he have to lose? So one night, with nothing but a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, he entered the Blackwood forest. And the fountain found him. It was smaller than he had imagined. Not grand or elaborate, just a simple stone basin, cracked with age, filled with dark water that reflected nothing. The air around it was thick, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan knelt beside the fountain, his heart hammering. The old woman had told him the rules. "Speak your wish aloud. Take only one sip. No more, no less." His voice trembled as he whispered the words, "I wish for my daughter to live." Then before he could hesitate, he cupped his hands, scooped up the cold water, and drank. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the pain struck. A searing, burning agony shot through his veins, as if the water was made of fire and ice at once. He doubled over, gasping, his vision swimming. And then it stopped. The air grew still again. The fountain's water was as dark and motionless as before. And deep in his bones, Ethan knew something had changed. His wish had been granted. But at what cost? Ethan returned home before dawn. When he entered Lily's room, he nearly collapsed. She was sitting up, awake, alive. Her skin, once pale and sickly, was flush with color. The dark circles beneath her eyes were gone. She smiled at him, her small hands reaching out. "Daddy," she whispered. Tears blurred his vision. He dropped to his knees, holding her close. It had worked. She was alive. For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to hope, but the hope did not last. That night, something changed. Lily spoke in her sleep, murmuring in a language Ethan didn't recognize. At first, he thought it was nonsense, the babbling of a dreaming child. Then her voice deepened. It was not the voice of a 6-year-old girl, and the words, though unfamiliar, made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The next morning, she didn't remember speaking at all, but Ethan did, and he felt cold all over. Days passed, and at first it seemed like a miracle. Lily was stronger than ever. She no longer needed medicine. She ran, she played, she laughed. But Ethan noticed the changes, the way she sometimes tilted her head, as if listening to something no one else could hear, the way her eyes lingered on dark corners, her gaze unfocused, distant. And then there were the animals. It started with their cat, Pumpkin. One morning, Ethan found the cat curled up at the foot of Lily's bed, lifeless. No wounds, no signs of illness. Just gone. Then it was the neighbor's dog. Then the birds in the trees outside her window. Each morning, something new. Each morning, something dead. Ethan tried to convince himself it was coincidence, until the night he woke to find Lily standing by his bed. Her head was tilted at that unnatural angle. Her lips moved silently, whispering words he could not understand. And her eyes, they were wrong. Too dark, too deep, as if something else was looking through them. Ethan went back to the hospital, searching for the old nurse. But no one knew who he was talking about. No one had ever seen her. Frantic, he returned to the woods, searching for the fountain. But it was gone. The trees stretched endlessly, the path twisting in ways it hadn't before. The forest had swallowed it, as if it had never been there at all. But he knew the truth. He had made a wish, and the fountain had granted it. But it had never promised that Lily would return the same. The thing wearing Lily's skin became less and less like his daughter. She still looked like Lily. She still sounded like Lily. But Ethan knew, the way she watched him, the way she smiled, the way she whispered at night, speaking to something only she could see. One evening, as the sun set, she climbed into his lap, resting her head against his chest. "Daddy," she said softly, "you look sad." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm just tired, sweetheart." She lifted her face, her small fingers touching his cheek. Her smile widened. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I can make a wish for you too." Ethan never told anyone what happened next. By morning he was gone. No trace of him remained, except for Lily, alive, smiling, unchanged. And somewhere, deep in the Blackwood forest, the fountain waits. It is always waiting for the next desperate soul to come searching, for the next wish to be made, for the next price to be paid. There is a place whispered about in half-remembered dreams, a building that stands at the edge of memory itself. A library. No one knows who built it. No one knows who tends to it. No records mention its construction. No maps mark its location. And yet, those who need it most always find it. Inside, the shelves stretch endlessly, filled with books no one remembers writing. Books that should not exist. Books that hold secrets long forgotten, and some that were meant to be lost. Those who enter may leave with answers they never sought. But the library does not give without taking, and some who step inside never leave at all. It began with a letter. Daniel Mercer found it on his doorstep one autumn morning, resting atop the day's mail. There was no return address, no stamp, no sign of how it had arrived. Just his name, written in careful script. Inside was a single sentence. "The book you have forgotten waits for you." Daniel frowned. It had to be a joke. But as he read the words again, A strange feeling crept over him. A memory just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Had he written a book? That was impossible. He was an editor, not an author. He had spent his life working with books, reading them, shaping them, but he had never written one. And yet, something about the letter felt familiar, as if, deep down, he already knew exactly where he needed to go. The address led Daniel to a part of town he had never been before. The streets were empty, silent. The buildings here were old, their windows dark, their doors long shut. It was a place abandoned by time, forgotten by the city around it. And then he saw it, the library. It was taller than the surrounding buildings, its stone walls covered in ivy, its massive doors made of black oak. A name was carved into the stone archway above, the Library of Forgotten Books. Daniel hesitated. Something about the air around the building felt heavy, as if the space itself did not want to be disturbed, but the letter in his pocket burned against his skin. The book he had forgotten was inside, and he had to find it. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of noise, but true, absolute silence. No footsteps, no rustling of pages, no sound at all. The second thing he noticed was the sheer size of the place. From the outside, the library had looked large, but inside it was endless. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lined with chandeliers that flickered with dim, golden light. Rows upon rows of bookshelves extended beyond sight, vanishing into shadowy corridors. There was no front desk, no sign of a librarian, only the books. He stepped forward, drawn deeper into the maze of shelves. The books here were unlike any he had ever seen. Some were bound in cracked leather, others in smooth velvet. Some were thick as bricks, others no larger than his palm. He reached for one at random, running his fingers over the title embossed on the spine, and froze. It was his name, Daniel Mercer. His breath caught. Slowly, he pulled the book from the shelf. The cover was blank, smooth to the touch. He opened it, and there in ink that was unmistakably his own handwriting were the first words. "I don't remember writing this." Page after page, Daniel read. It was his story, a book detailing his life, his childhood, his teenage years, his struggles, his failures. But then, the book continued beyond what he knew. It told stories of events he did not remember, decisions he had never made, people he had never met, yet felt painfully familiar, a version of himself that had taken different paths, made different choices, a version that had written this book. His hands shook as he turned another page, and then a name, one that sent ice through his veins. Emily. He nearly dropped the book. Emily had been his wife. She had died 5 years ago. A car accident. Sudden, unexpected. A moment that had shattered his world. And yet, in this book, the story was different. Emily had lived, and Daniel, this other Daniel, had stayed with her, had grown old with her, had been happy. His breath came in short gasps. What was this? A story? A dream? A memory from a life he had never lived? Had he written this? No, this wasn't possible. And yet, it was here, in ink, in print. A life that could have been, a life that had been, somewhere, sometime, a life he had forgotten. He turned the page and found one final sentence, scrawled in handwriting that was his, yet not his. "Would you take it back?" A voice shattered the silence. "You should not have opened that book." Daniel whirled. A figure stood in the shadows between the shelves, tall, cloaked in robes as dark as ink. Their face was obscured beneath a deep hood, but their voice was smooth, ageless. "You should leave. the figure continued, before the library takes more than you are willing to give. Daniel gripped the book tightly. What is this place? The figure took a slow step forward. This is where forgotten things go. Lost stories, unwritten endings, lives that could have been. Daniel's throat was dry. And this book? It is yours. The librarian's voice was gentle now, almost sad. A life you lost, a life you forgot. Daniel's fingers dug into the cover. If I take it, he whispered, does that mean I get it back? The librarian was silent, and in that silence, Daniel already knew the answer. The book was here because he had forgotten it, and to take it back would mean losing something else. Daniel stood at the entrance of the library, the book heavy in his hands. He could leave now, return to his life, accept what had been lost, or he could stay, turn the page, reclaim the life he had once lived, the life where Emily had never died. But if he did, something else would take its place in the library, something he would never remember again. He took a deep breath and made his choice. The doors of the library swung shut behind him, and in the silence, another book appeared on the shelf, waiting for the next visitor to find it, waiting for the next forgotten story to be remembered. There is a legend whispered among scholars and treasure hunters, a tale of a stone unlike any other. It does not shimmer like diamonds or glow like moonstone. It does not gleam in firelight or glisten under the sun. It is black, darker than black, a stone that absorbs all light but never reflects it. Some say it is a relic from a time before time, a fragment of the void itself. Others claim it is a curse, a wound in the fabric of reality. Few have ever seen it. Fewer still have dared to touch it, and those who have never tell their stories, because once the stone takes the light from the world around it, it begins to take other things as well. Nathan Carter was not a man who believed in curses. He was a scientist, a geologist by trade, and he had spent his life chasing the mysteries of the earth, volcanic glass, meteorites, crystals that seemed almost alive under the microscope. But nothing had ever intrigued him like the reports coming out of the Black Hollow caverns, a cave system deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains, untouched by human hands for centuries. It had only been discovered months ago when an earthquake had cracked open a passageway long buried beneath layers of rock. The initial reports were strange. Hikers had wandered too close and spoken of a darkness that felt too deep, of flashlights that dimmed and camera flashes that barely illuminated anything at all. And then there was the miner. He had gone in alone looking for signs of gold or precious metals. When he emerged, his hair had gone white. His eyes were wide, distant, wrong. He had no memory of what had happened. Only a single phrase muttered over and over again, "It swallows everything." Nathan dismissed it as hysteria. That was, until they found the stone. It sat on a pedestal of natural rock, as if the cave itself had grown around it, a perfect sphere, smooth as glass, cold as ice, blacker than the deepest void. Nathan had seen obsidian before. He had studied basalt, onyx, jet, every naturally dark mineral known to science. This was different. It didn't just appear black. It was an absence, a wound in the world, a hole where light should have been. His flashlight shone directly on it, but the beam simply stopped. No reflection, no glare, just nothing. He reached out, fingers hesitating. Then before anyone could stop him, he touched it. The cold shot through his hand like an electric shock. Nathan gasped, yanking his fingers back, cradling them against his chest. His heart pounded. No one else moved. They were all staring, not at him, at the stone. It was changing. Where before it had been smooth, now it seemed to shift, rippling like the surface of a pond. The darkness within it churned, something moving inside. The flashlight in his other hand flickered, then went out. So did every other light in the cave. For a single suffocating moment, there was only darkness. And in that darkness, something breathed. When the lights flickered back on, the stone was gone. Nathan staggered backward, his breath ragged. His team looked around, confused, terrified. "Where did it go?" one of them whispered. Nathan didn't answer, because he felt it, a weight in his pocket. Slowly, with shaking hands, he reached down and pulled it out. The stone sat in his palm, unchanged, but the darkness it carried was inside him now too. He could feel it, a pull at the edges of his thoughts, a whisper just beyond hearing, and the hunger, a deep, gnawing hunger that was not his own. The first thing to disappear was his reflection. It happened 2 days after he brought the stone home. He had been washing his hands, staring absently at the bathroom mirror, when he noticed it. His toothbrush was there, the sink, the window behind him, but not him. No reflection, no shadow. As if the light that touched him no longer bounced back. As if the stone was swallowing more than just light. The second thing to go was his shadow. At first, it was just a trick of the light, a missing outline beneath his feet. But soon he noticed it even in the brightest daylight. There was nothing, no shape stretching behind him, no darkness beneath him, as if he no longer existed in the eyes of the world. Then the voices started. They came at night, soft, murmuring voices. Not words, just sounds, shifting and writhing, moving inside his mind like tendrils of black mist. And with them came the visions, dark corridors that stretched for miles. Endless voids filled with shapes that were not human, and the feeling that he was being watched, not watched, remembered. He tried to throw the stone away. He drove to the farthest reaches of the city, hurled it into the river, watched it sink into the churning waters. But when he got home, it was there, sitting on his nightstand, waiting. Nathan stopped leaving his house. People no longer seemed to notice him anyway. At first, he thought they were ignoring him. Then he realized they truly did not see him. The cashier at the grocery store stared right through him. His landlord knocked on the door to demand rent, only to mumble, "No one's lived here for months," before walking away. His mother called, left a voicemail saying she missed him, saying she wished he would visit, saying it was so hard after his disappearance. Nathan screamed into the phone, but no one heard. No one ever would again, because the stone had taken everything, his light, his reflection, his shadow, his existence. And soon, even he would not remember who he had been. The last thing he saw before the world went completely dark was the stone, sitting on his desk, waiting for the next hand to touch it, waiting for the next life to swallow, waiting, always waiting, for the next light to take. Everyone in the town of Black Hollow knew about the house on Hollow Street. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. A looming Victorian structure with peeling paint and broken shutters, its once grand windows now coated in dust. But there was one window, the one on the second floor, right in the center of the house, that was different, because no matter the time of day, no matter the season, that window was always clean, as if something inside was watching. Most people avoided the house. Some claimed they saw a figure standing at the window when they walked past at night. Others swore they felt an unseen gaze crawling over their skin. But no one ever went inside. No one except Eleanor Harper, and she had no choice, because the house had just become hers. Eleanor had never met her great-aunt Margaret. She barely knew the woman had existed until she received the letter. To Miss Eleanor Harper, you are the last surviving heir to the Hollow Street estate. The house now belongs to you. However, there is one rule you must always follow. Never look through the second floor window after midnight. Sincerely, Walter and Finch Law Offices. Eleanor scoffed. A superstition, a silly warning. She wasn't afraid of ghost stories. And so, 3 days later, she arrived at her new home. The house smelled of dust and age, its wooden floors creaking beneath her boots. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and the air felt thick, heavy, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. But what struck her most was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty home, but a silence that felt aware. She shook off the feeling and went to explore. It was just a house, nothing more, or so she thought. Because as she walked through the halls, she felt it. That familiar crawling sensation, like she was being watched. And when she turned the corner, her heart stopped. There at the end of the hallway was the window, the one from the stories. The glass was pristine, reflecting the pale evening light. And as Eleanor stepped closer, something moved behind it, a shadow, there for only a second, and then gone. That night, Eleanor tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the feeling that she was not alone. By midnight, she had enough. She wasn't going to let an old house and a stupid superstition keep her awake. She climbed out of bed, barefoot and shivering, and made her way to the second floor. The house was silent, too silent. She turned the corner, and there was the window. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. But the window, it was wrong. The reflection wasn't hers. Her breath hitched, because in the glass staring back at her was a woman, but not Eleanor. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too dark. And as Eleanor took a step back, the woman in the window smiled. Eleanor stumbled backward, her pulse pounding. She turned, expecting someone, anyone, to be behind her. But the hallway was empty. The house was still. Only the window remained. Only the woman in the glass. Eleanor forced herself to look again. This time the woman was closer. No longer a distant reflection, but right against the glass. Watching her, waiting. And then, ever so softly, she tapped on the glass. A slow, deliberate sound. Eleanor ran. The next morning, Eleanor searched the house. She had to find an answer, a reason for what she had seen. That's when she found the attic, a dusty old room filled with forgotten things, and at the very back, a locked trunk. She forced it open, coughing as dust billowed around her. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Margaret Hollow, all with the same warning: do not look through the window after midnight. Then she found the journal. Her great-aunt's handwriting was hurried, desperate. And as Eleanor read, the truth came to light. The window did not reflect the outside world. It reflected something else, something that had been trapped in the glass for over a century. She watches, she waits, she wants to take my place. I must never look. I must never let her out. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Her hands shook, because at the bottom of the final page, there was a single line, a final warning. If you see her, it's already too late. And then, from downstairs, a soft tapping on glass. Eleanor froze. The tapping came again, slow, patient. She moved to the attic door, heart hammering. She could leave, run, never look back. But as she stepped forward, a voice whispered her name, not from the door, not from the walls, but from behind her. She turned and saw the attic window. The glass was no longer empty. The woman was inside it, not a reflection, not a trick of the light. Inside, and she was smiling. Then, the glass cracked, a small, jagged line, a line that should not have been there. And Eleanor realized the window wasn't just watching, it was waiting, waiting for someone to set it free. The crack spidered outward, the woman's hand pressed against the glass, and Eleanor understood. If the window broke, the thing inside would escape and take her place, just as it had been waiting to do for 100 years. She had to act now. Eleanor grabbed the heaviest object she could find, a rusted iron lantern. She swung it hard. The attic window shattered, but not outward. Inward, the woman in the glass let out a shriek, a sound that rattled the very bones of the house. Then, she vanished. The wind howled, the house shuddered, and then, silence. Eleanor barely breathed. The window was gone. The woman was gone. And the house was watching no more. Eleanor left the Hollow Street house that very night. She never returned. The house remained empty, decaying, forgotten. But the window remained clean, perfect, unbroken. And if you walked by at night, if you looked closely enough, sometimes just for a second, you'd see a face in the glass, smiling, waiting, watching. They said the garden had been dead for over a century. No one tended it. No one walked its stone pathways. Yet under the light of the full moon, the flowers bloomed. At least that's what the story said. Lillian had never believed in myths. She was a botanist, a scientist, a woman who relied on facts, not folklore. But when a letter arrived summoning her to Blackwood Manor, she had no choice but to reconsider. To Miss Lillian Moore, you are cordially invited to Blackwood Manor as the new caretaker of the estate gardens. Compensation will be generous. There is only one rule: never visit the garden before nightfall. Sincerely, Edmund Blackwood. Lillian hesitated. Blackwood Manor had been abandoned for decades. No one had seen Edmund Blackwood in years. Yet here was an invitation, a mystery, and she had never been able to resist a mystery. So with curiosity outweighing her doubts, she packed her bags and set off for the garden that only bloomed under moonlight. The journey to Blackwood Manor took her deep into the countryside, where the roads grew narrow and the trees loomed like watchful sentinels. When she finally arrived, the house stood like a ghost of the past. It was massive, its stone walls draped in ivy, its windows dark. An old man awaited her at the entrance, thin, pale, his eyes shadowed with secrets. "You are Lillian Moore?" he asked. She nodded. "You received my letter?" "Yes, but I don't understand. Why do you need a caretaker if the garden is dead?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because it is not dead." He turned, gesturing for her to follow. And as night fell, he led her to the garden. The garden stretched behind the manor, hidden by towering hedges and wrought iron gates. In the daylight, it was a graveyard of plants, withered vines, shriveled petals, stone fountains choked with moss. But then, the moon rose, and everything changed. The moment silver light touched the earth, the dead plants shivered. Color bled into them, like ink swirling through water. Roses unfurled. Lilies awoke. Lavender breathed. The garden was alive, and Lillian had never seen anything more beautiful. She turned to Edmund, heart racing. "How is this possible?" He watched the flowers with something close to reverence. The Blackwood garden has always belonged to the night. No sunlight will ever touch its roots. No warmth will ever nurture its petals. But under the moon, it will never die. Lillian's skin prickled. "That's not natural." Edmund's gaze was unreadable. Number, it isn't. And that was when she saw them. The glowing figures between the trees, watching, waiting, and for the first time she realized she was not alone in the garden. Lillian's breath caught. Dozens of figures stood among the blossoms, pale, translucent, their eyes like reflections on still water. They did not move, did not breathe, yet the flowers leaned toward them, as if the spirits were the very thing keeping them alive. "Who are they?" Lillian whispered. Edmund's expression darkened. They are the ones who never left. Her pulse pounded. Ghosts? Not quite. Then what are they? Edmund hesitated. Then quietly, caretakers. Lillian's mouth went dry. Caretakers? But I thought... She couldn't finish the sentence, because she already knew. Caretakers never left. Lillian spent the next few nights exploring the garden. She studied the plants, touched the petals that shouldn't be alive, felt the way the vines seemed to breathe beneath her fingertips. And all the while the spirits watched, she tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the science. But science could not explain why the flowers bled silver when cut, why the roots pulsed like veins, why she swore she could hear whispers in the wind. And then, one night, she found the grave. It was hidden beneath a canopy of moonflowers, a single marble headstone weathered by time. There was no name, only a sentence carved into the stone. The garden always remembers. A shadow fell across her. She turned, and Edmund stood behind her. You found it. His voice was heavy. Lillian swallowed hard. Whose grave is this? A pause, then, softly, the last caretaker. Her skin chilled. What happened to them? Edmund's eyes lifted to the moonlit canopy. They became part of the garden, and in that moment, she understood why the spirits never left, why the plants lived only at night, why the garden always needed a caretaker. Because the garden did not grow, it fed, and she had been invited not to tend to it, but to join it. Lillian ran, through the maze of flowers, past the ghostly figures toward the manor. But the garden had other plans. Vines curled around her ankles, dragging her down. Petals whispered her name, and the spirits, the silent watchers, reached for her. You cannot leave, they murmured. The garden chose you. She clawed at the earth, her hands slick with silver sap. Eat umber. She would not be another nameless caretaker. She would not let the garden claim her. Her gaze locked onto the headstone. The garden always remembers. Then she saw it, a single withered flower growing at its base, a flower untouched by the moonlight, the only dead thing in the garden. With shaking hands, she ripped it free. The moment the roots tore from the soil, the garden screamed. The spirits flickered, the vines withered, and the flowers began to fall like ash, like dying stars, like the garden itself was finally letting go. And then everything went dark. When Lillian awoke, the garden was gone. Not dead, gone. The hedges, the flowers, the pathways vanished, as if they had never existed. The manor stood silent behind her. The moon, still full, shone over an empty field. Only the grave remained, and beside it, a single white flower, blooming under the starlight, waiting for the next caretaker, for the garden to return, because the garden always remembered, and one day, it would bloom again. No one knew how old the Evershade Forest was. It had been there before the first settlers arrived, before the towns were built, before the roads were paved. The trees stood impossibly tall, their trunks thick and ancient, their branches heavy with leaves, leaves that never withered, never browned, never fell. Autumn passed, winter came and went, spring breathed life into the world, and summer warmed the land. But in Evershade, the leaves remained, always green, always still, as if time itself had forgotten to touch them. The townsfolk whispered stories, that those who entered never came out, that the trees could speak, that something in the heart of the forest was watching. Of course, no one truly believed the tales. No one except Avery Hale. And she had a reason to, because 12 years ago, when she was only 6 years old, her brother went into the forest and never came back. Now at 18, she was finally ready to go after him. Avery stood at the tree line, staring into the dense green abyss before her. She clutched the worn leather journal in her hands, her brother's journal. It was the only thing he had left behind, found near the edge of the forest the morning after he vanished. The final entry was unfinished, ending in a single sentence. The leaves do not fall because the forest does not let go. A chill ran through her as she traced the ink with her fingers. "I'm coming, Jake," she whispered. Then without another word, she stepped forward, and the forest swallowed her whole. The deeper Avery walked, the heavier the silence became. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something waiting. There were no falling leaves, no crunch of dead foliage beneath her boots. The air was thick with the scent of earth and rain, but there was something else beneath it. Something wrong. She glanced up. The leaves, lush and green, did not move. Not a single one. No matter how strong the wind blew, they remained perfectly still. Avery shivered. She flipped open her brother's journal, scanning the pages for something, anything that might tell her what lay ahead. And then she found it. A drawing, rough, hurried, ink smudged. It showed a tree unlike the others. Its roots were massive, twisting, forming something that looked almost like a door. And beneath it, Jake had scrawled, "The heart of Evershade, the place where the leaves are bound." Avery swallowed hard. If Jake had made it that far, maybe he was still alive. She pressed forward, and the trees closed in behind her. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt strange here, unmoving, like the leaves above. Avery's legs ached, but she didn't stop. Then, she heard it, a whisper, not in her ears, in her mind. "You should not be here." Avery spun, heart pounding. Nothing, just trees. But as she turned back, something moved, a shadow flitting between the trunks. Too fast, too tall, not human. Avery's breath hitched. She quickened her pace, gripping the journal like a lifeline. And then she saw it, the tree from the drawing, the heart of Evershade. It was massive, its bark dark as ink, its roots rising from the earth like grasping fingers. And at its base, a door, not wooden, not stone, but woven from twisting vines and tangled branches. Avery's pulse raced. She stepped closer, and the whisper returned. Turn back, but she didn't. She reached out, and the door opened on its own. The moment Avery stepped inside, the world changed. The air grew thick, heavy, buzzing with energy. She was no longer in the forest. Not really, because above her, instead of a sky, was a swirling mass of leaves, thousands upon thousands, suspended in midair, locked in place by something unseen. And in the center of it all, a figure, a boy. Avery's heart leapt into her throat. "Jake!" Her brother stood beneath the floating canopy, his face pale, his eyes distant, as if he had been here for years and seconds all at once. "Avery!" His voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a long, long time. Tears burned in her eyes. "Come on, we have to go." But Jake didn't move. He just looked up, at the leaves above. "I can't," he whispered. "The forest won't let me." Then Avery saw it. The roots curled around his ankles, tight, holding him in place, like he had become part of the forest. And overhead, the leaves quivered. For the first time they moved, not falling, but reaching downward toward her. Avery lunged forward, grabbing her brother's arms, trying to pull him free. "No!" Jake gasped. "You don't understand." The forest shuddered, the air turned to whispers, and the trees spoke. "The leaves do not fall because we do not let go." Avery's vision blurred. The leaves overhead rippled like water. And suddenly, she understood. The trees were not just trees. The leaves were not just leaves. They were memories, people, every soul the forest had ever claimed, trapped, held, never falling, never fading, never free. Avery's hands trembled, her brother's face twisted in pain. Avery, if you want to save me, you have to break the forest's hold. She looked up, at the sky of leaves, at the souls suspended above, and she knew what she had to do. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Let go." And for the first time in eternity, a leaf fell, then another, and another, and the forest screamed. The roots around Jake's ankles snapped. The swirling leaves descended, raining down like autumn's first breath. And as they touched the earth, they vanished, one by one, fading into mist. The whispers faded, the trees stilled, and the forest let go. Avery clutched her brother, gasping. "Did it work?" she whispered. Jake looked around. Then for the first time in 12 years, he smiled. The leaves are falling, and somewhere, deep within the evershade, the trees began to weep, because for the first time in forever, autumn had finally come. It began in a place few ever found, and even fewer left unchanged. Nestled between two towering buildings in the oldest part of the city stood Eldrin's antiquarian bookshop. It had no listed address, no advertisements, and no modern lighting, only a small wooden sign above the door, its carved letters nearly worn away. Books seek their readers. Ilara Voss had been searching for something. She wasn't sure what, only that a restlessness had crept into her bones, an itch in her mind that could only be scratched by words long forgotten. So when she stumbled across Eldrin's, its dust-coated window displays filled with ancient tomes and maps, she stepped inside without hesitation. The scent of old paper and ink wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Rows upon rows of books filled the cramped space, their spines lined with gold lettering, strange symbols, and titles in languages she had never seen before. And behind the counter, an old man with silver-threaded hair and eyes as sharp as a raven's watched her as if he had been waiting. "Are you looking for something in particular?" he asked. Ilara hesitated. "Something unusual?" The man's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Then you should see this." He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a book wrapped in a deep red cloth. When he set it before her, she felt something shift in the air. The moment she touched the cover, her breath caught. The leather was warm, and for the first time in her life, she felt that peculiar itch in her mind ease. The old man nodded, as if satisfied. "A book finds its reader when the time is right. But be warned, this one does not forgive curiosity." Ilara barely heard him. She was already opening the book. And then, it was too late. The book's pages were thick and heavy, filled with writing that shimmered like ink still wet. The words shifted beneath her gaze as though alive. And then, the letters moved. They twisted, unraveling into shapes that should not exist. Ilara gasped, jerking back. But the book would not let her. The pages flipped wildly, faster than the wind, filling the shop with the rustle of ancient whispers. And then, in a language she had never learned, the book spoke. "The door has been opened." A chill crawled down her spine. She tried to close the book, to push it shut, to tear her hands away, but they would not move. The old man sighed. "Ah, so it chose you after all?" Ilara's heartbeat thundered. "What is this?" she gasped. The old man leaned on the counter, watching her with something like pity. "A book that, once opened, can never be closed. And now, it is yours." Ilara stumbled backward, her hands still clutching the book, the pages still turning. Images flickered across them now, scenes she did not recognize yet felt oddly familiar. A tower lost to time, a forest where shadows moved without light, A face she should have known but didn't. "What is this showing me?" she demanded. The old man tilted his head. "Your story, your past, your present, and the future you have not yet written." Ilara's breath hitched. "I don't understand." The old man sighed, rubbing his temples. "The book is not just ink and paper. It is a story unfolding. Your story, and it will never end until you do." A terrible weight settled in Ilara's chest. She looked down at the pages, flipping through them with growing panic. Some were filled with words she had not yet lived. Some were blank, waiting. And no matter how hard she tried, the book would not close. Days passed, then weeks. Ilara could not leave the book behind. It followed her. If she set it on a table, she would find it beside her bed in the morning. If she locked it in a drawer, it would reappear on her lap. And worst of all, the story kept writing itself. Every night when the world was quiet, the pages filled with words. Words she had never written, events she had not yet lived. Until one night, the book revealed something new. A page far ahead in the story, one covered in dark ink, written in jagged, frantic strokes. And at the bottom, a single sentence: "The story ends in blood." Ilara's breath hitched. She slammed the book shut, or tried to, but the moment her fingers lifted from the cover, it flew open again. The words pulsed like a living thing, and the date written above the final page was tomorrow. Ilara refused to be trapped. If the book could write her story, then maybe she could change it. She grabbed a pen, flipping to the cursed page, and began to write. Ilara does not die. Ilara finds a way to close the book. The ink shimmered. The words shifted. For a moment, she thought it had worked, until a new sentence appeared beneath her own. Ilara does not decide the ending. And the ink bled through the page, consuming her words until all that remained was, "The story ends in blood." A sudden knock at her door made her freeze. Then another, and another, slow, deliberate. Ilara turned toward the book. The pages flipped, stopping on an illustration of her front door and the shadow standing behind it. The knocking grew louder, and the book whispered, "The final chapter begins." Ilara ran. She grabbed the book, tore through the streets, and found herself standing in front of Eldrin's. The old man was waiting. His eyes landed on the book, then on her. "Ah," he murmured. "You understand now." Ilara gasped for breath. "How do I stop this?" The old man shook his head. "You don't. A story must have an ending. But it does not have to be this one." He gestured toward the book. "If you want to change the ending, you must finish the story." Ilara's fingers tightened on the cover. She understood. She lifted the pen and wrote one final line. "The book closes." The words shuddered. The book trembled. And for the first time, the pages stopped turning. Slowly, hesitantly, the cover began to close. And as it did, the shadow behind her door vanished. The story had ended, and Ilara was free. Or so she thought, because the book still remained, waiting for its next reader.